Hello, algebra students, and welcome to Chapter 9, Section 3, Solving Quadratic Equations. In this section, we will learn to solve quadratic equations by graphing and finding square roots. Our essential understanding for this section is that we can solve quadratic functions in a variety of different ways, just like with linear functions. In this lesson, we're going to focus on graphing and finding square roots. Before we get started, we need to realize that all quadratic functions have an equation counterpart, or that we can change them to an equation pretty quickly. So we've seen functions like this already in this chapter. Y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, just kind of a standard form. This would be a quadratic equation because there's an x squared in it. To make this function an equation, we simply take out the y and put a 0 in there. Because when we solve quadratic functions and their equations, we're looking for what value of x will make that half of the equation equal 0. First, we're going to talk about solving quadratic functions by graphing. To use this method, we have to do the following. First of all, we need a graph of the quadratic. Sometimes that'll be given to us. Sometimes we have to graph it ourselves, so we have to remember those rules on graphing. Once we have it graphed in front of us, what we're looking for is we're looking for the x-intercepts, or where does that parabola touch the x-axis. Now, one thing I want to point out is that you could have 1 point where the parabola touches the x-axis, you could have 2 points, or you could have no points. Most of the time you're going to have 2. Sometimes you'll only have 1, and that'll be just when the vertex is touching, and we'll see that in the example on the next slide. So real quick here, these are examples out of your books. The directions say find the solutions to the following functions. Notice that we're graphing the actual function here, but we're looking at the equation as well. Either way, when we graph this, we get this parabola here, for example, A. Now our job here, if we're finding the solutions or the answers to this equation, we are going to look for the x-intercept here. So as we look at this parabola, where does it cross or intersect the x-axis? Well, we have these 2 points right here, this one and this one. So we have 2 answers. Our answers are going to be x equal, looks like -1 there, and x equals +1 there. So this is an example of a parabola that has, or a quadratic function that has 2 answers. It crosses the x-axis in 2 points. On example B here, if you take a look at the graph, this is x squared equals 0. Notice that there's only 1 point that crosses the x-axis. That's the vertex. So if the vertex is the only thing touching the x-axis, you only have one answer. So the answer here will be x equals 0, or that point where we're intercepting the x-axis. Finally, we have the third type of problem you'll see here. Again, example A, we have 2 answers. Example B, we have 1 answer. On example C, take a look at this parabola. Where does it cross the x-axis? Well, it doesn't. So we can say that there is no solution. And again, this will happen when the function or the parabola just doesn't cross the axis, whether it opens up and it starts above the x-axis or opens down and starts below the x-axis. Sometimes this can happen. So here's your first U-try problem. Complete it both in your notes and in the Google form below. The second method we're going to look at when solving quadratics is finding square roots. To solve using the square roots method, we simply have to solve for x. We're going to use equations. So since quadratics have an x squared, when we solve for x or get x by itself, our last step will be to square root x or get rid of that square. So these are actually some pretty simple examples. They don't get too much harder than this. But if we look at example A, the directions say solve by finding the square roots. So when I solve an equation, we're trying to get our variable by itself. So here I have 3x squared minus 75. Now the first step I have to do here is add 75 to both sides. Show my work going down. So I'm now going to have 3x squared equals 75. Now, two things are happening to x here. You can think of it like two things. We have a 3 multiplied by x, and we have x squared. We have to undo this in the order of reverse order of operations, meaning I have to divide by 3 first here. So showing my work going down, I'm going to have x squared equals 75 divided by 3 is 25. I'm actually going to show my work over here. That way I can show you this last step here. We have x squared equals 25. We have to get rid of the square here. So we have to do the opposite operation of squaring something, and that's to take the square root. So to get rid of that square, I'm going to square root one side, and what I do to one side, I have to do to the other, so I'm going to square root the right side. Now the square root of x squared is just x. That's what undoes the square there. Now, we have to remember that when we square root a number, a positive number, we get two answers. We get a positive square root and a negative square root. And if you think about it, we're really finding what number times itself gets to 25. Well, positive 5 times a positive 5 will get us to 25, and a negative 5 times a negative 5 will also get us to positive 25. We have to account for both answers there. And if, as you saw in the last type of problem when we were graphing, we can have two answers. In fact, we do have two answers here. So I can write my answer like this: x equals plus or minus 5. That's how we would read it. Or I can write it as x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. That's up to you. I think this is the simpler, shorter way to show that. On the last example here, first step I need to do is I need to subtract here to get rid of that 9. So when I do that, I'm going to have negative r squared equals negative 9. I need to divide by this negative 1 first. I have to get this r positive by itself before I can even think about square rooting. So I'm going to divide by negative 1 to get rid of the negative on both sides, which will give me, show my work up here, negative r squared divided by negative 1 is just r squared. And negative 9 divided by negative 1 is 9. Last step here, which you'll find with most, if not all, of these problems, we will square root both sides to get r by itself. So r will equal not just 3, but plus or minus 3, meaning that this function has two answers. Here's your second and final you try problem. Complete it both in your notes and in the Google form below. And have a good day.